You know, today we get excited that we have St. Patrick's Day, Cinco de Mayo. We have, the Germans with Oktoberfest. These are old traditions, but they're part of America too. So, it's a kind of that bring people together. It's kind of strange in the sense that diversity, you think, oh, you got too many different things going on and you separate us. But diversity also, for the individuals, gives them pride in their culture and they bring it together. So that's why in America we have that, which is you don't have in many countries.
This is John Williams. I am a volunteer interviewer with the Kizuna Project. It is Saturday, February 7th, 2026. I am in Tucson, Arizona, at the home of Dr. Minoru Yanagihashi. Dr. Yanagihashi, may I call you Min for the purposes of this interview? Do I have your permission?
Yes.
To conduct this video recording interview?
Right.
Right, thank you. Let us begin with some basic information. When and where were you born, and of what does your immediate family consist?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I'm a Japanese American, Nisei, second generation. My parents came over as immigrants in a young age, and they established themselves in Hawaii. Now, my father, or grandfather, was a tinsmith. And my father inherited the business, and it became a plumbing business. So that's what he was, a plumbing contractor. I grew up in Honolulu and attended the public school, English-speaking public school, and also the Japanese language school, which was held in the late afternoon for about 1 or 2 hours. So, but unfortunately, the Japanese language education was interrupted by Pearl Harbor attack, and of course the school was canceled out. So yes, that ended it.
What was the year of your birth, the date of your birth?
Okay, it's 1932. So I was 9 years old when the Pearl Harbor attack occurred. But I do remember the attack very well. And, in terms of actually suffering directly from the attack, no, we weren't bombed. But accidents happened, and there were civilian deaths. Unfortunately, these things occur. My neighbors, for example, the kiddos were fishermen, and they were out returning when they were strafed. The boat was strafed by a P-40 American aircraft, and both father and son were killed, my neighbors. So, immediate impact was there.
Tell us about your educational background, particularly when you got your doctorate.
Mm-hmm. Right. I was always interested in my heritage, and it's not that when I began my education in upper division that I decided on the Japanese studies, but I gravitated toward it. And so I ended up with a major in East Asian history from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I went on with my education, getting a master's degree from Berkeley and also a PhD from the University of Michigan. So I have been involved academically with Japanese studies for many, many years, and I retired here at the University of Arizona. So what, maintained this interest is always from childhood. I was always interested in Japanese history and its background, so it was a natural thing.
And you've actually written 4 books. Is that correct?
Right.
And one that relates to our discussion today. Would you show that one, please?
Yeah, this is one of my books on, it's called Japanese American Experience. And it's not a biography, but what I wanted to do was to highlight what the Japanese Americans, the Nisei especially, experienced. So this is what I focused on, just the highlights of the experiences. Basically, it ended up with concentration on the pre-war experience, the wartime experience in Hawaii and on the mainland, and of course, the present-day contemporary scene.
All right, now let's talk about what were the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Units. Can you tell us about those?
Okay. The 100 and 442 military units were unique. They were all Japanese Americans. Now, they were led by white officers. There were a few Nisei officers, but we're talking about an all Japanese American unit. So that is quite unusual. Why did this happen? Well, I can't get into the full detail here, but just to summarize, there were already Niseis in the National Guard of Hawaii when Pearl Harbor attack occurred. And these people were immediately put on duty. There were also university students in the ROTC for Niseis. So they also were brought into the National Guard. So what we had to combine a new unit called the Hawaiian Territorial National Guard. That became the nucleus of eventually morphing into what was known as the Provisional Infantry Battalion. Eventually it became the 100th Infantry Battalion, the famous 100th Infantry Battalion. But that's how it progressed. You know, when these Nisei soldiers reported for duty and carried out their duties, there were complaints. Why are Japs guarding our facilities? How dare they do this? So the military says, okay, we're going to have to respond to this. They withdrew all the Nisei soldiers and said, well, you can't, take your weapons away, you can't carry out. So, and there was an immediate complaint from the Japanese community. Hey, what's going on? We're loyal American citizens. Now we're being treated like enemy aliens. What is this? So there was a big controversy about this. Many Americans at that time after Pearl Harbor, and you can't blame them, you've been attacked by the enemy. They said, well, the Japanese are, Japanese. You can't trust them. Potential subversive. So you have to control them somehow, imprison them or do something, move them out. So that was the problem from the very beginning of distrust. The only way that the Japanese Americans could do it to demonstrate their loyalty was for the males to volunteer to serve in the U.S. Army. Just talking about, I'm loyal, or, I'm going to buy war bonds or something like that, doesn't prove your loyalty for the vast majority of Americans. You have to actually physically do something. So they pushed for an all Nisei military unit. Of course, initially there was, quite a bit of a pushback on this. Eventually, they were able to convince the authorities that there was a need for only, volunteer unit, non-combative. So that's what happened. There was a VVV, varsity volunteer group. These were mostly made up of ROTC University students. They were inducted into the Army. They served as a labor force on Schofield Barracks. They dig ditches, strung up barbed wire fences, do road maintenance work. In other words, labor corps. That's what they were, non-combative. Of course, they didn't like this. They said, well, why are we doing all this? But you had to convince the authorities that somehow the Japanese Americans could become a combative unit. Eventually, they were able to convince the authorities, and that's how you started off with the 100th Battalion being formed.
How many were in the 100th Battalion?
Well, a battalion, if you know the military structure, a battalion has about 2,000 men or so, less than 2,000 men. Comprises of 3 rifle companies. So there's not a large number of people, yes. So now, when we talk about the other unit, the 442, that morphed. The 100 Battalion, unfortunately, it still took time for the military authorities to be fully convinced that they could be sent to combat. They went to training on the mainland, basically in Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and trained for a whole year. And that wasn't still enough. They were, the military said, well, we don't know what to do with them. But it took time. Meanwhile, so they went into combat, actually. Eventually, they were able to convince the upper officials that they could be used. And they were sent to North Africa. That's where they landed, in Oran, North Africa. And then General Eisenhower, the campaigning general of the entire region, says, well, I'm not going to handle this. Let General Clark decide. General Clark, Mark Clark, said, well, we can use them. And so he assigned them to a unit, the 34th Division. Oh, you know what this is? 34th Division, as you can see, is the shape of the insignia. Is the shape, it's an Ola, Mexican water jug, because the division was formed in Texas and New Mexico. And of course, the Red Bull is, of course, Longhorn, the original Southwestern origin. So the 31st Division was what the 442 was initially assigned to, and they fought with this unit, division, from the time they landed in Italy, in Salerno, all the way to Enzio, to Rome and beyond. At that point, the 442 replacement was started to come in, and it was decided by the higher authorities, military authorities, to assign the 442. By the time they had a record, a combat record that the military just admired. So why not attach them to the 36th Division? It has a T for Texas and a shape as an arrow to show that the origin of the division is in the southwestern United States. So that's how the 100 and the 442 developed, in stages. Now, interesting in going over this, and I'm not going to go into the combat history of the units, but the 442 came later. The 100 was there already fighting when the 442 replacement, not the whole unit, the replacement came to make up for the casualties suffered by the 100 Battalion. This is an unusual thing here, and I don't know whether it's a racial element or because of the wonderful wartime record of the 100, But instead of withdrawing the 100 as a unit, it just put in men one by one or by units replace the casualties. The 100, by the way, suffered tremendous casualties, especially in the battle for Casino. So they had to replace, the men that were casualties, and they took from the 442 individuals that were trained to fill up the spaces. So that was a kind of unique, way of replacing, and it shows the stages in which the whole thing developed. As a unit, it wasn't until after the Arnold campaign that the 442 replacement unit met with the 100 Battalion, and they combined and in a small Italian village of Civitavecchia. So, this is where you have the first combining of it. Now, if you ask, why is the 100 Battalion so unique? In most military unit, if you look at it, the structure of what is a regiment, you have 3 infantry battalions. There's a 1st Battalion, 2nd, and 3rd Infantry Battalion. But the 442, there is no 1st Battalion. Instead of the 1st Battalion, it's called the 100 Battalion. Why is this? Because by the time when they merged together, the 100 Battalion had such a meritorious combat record that the U.S. Army decided they deserved to maintain their designation, 100. We are not going to ask them to be the 1st Battalion. So this, in the U.S. Army, it is the only battalion called 100. Usually it's the 1st Battalion. So this is unique. It just shows you the recognition that the 100 had. So to this day, the 100 Battalion is still activated. It's amazing. Most World War II units have been totally deactivated. The 442, by the way, was an active reserve unit, but today it's deactivated. I had the fortune of being in the 442 after I served in Korea. When I came back, I still have some military time left. So they decided, well, we're going to assign you to the 442 as a reserve, unit. So that's why I reported to Fort de Rossi. And I was with the 442, and I picked up the insignia, which is interesting. It shows the origin of the 442. If you look very carefully, there's a taro leaf which shows a symbol of Hawaii, and on the bottom, on the other side, is a riverboat, Mississippi riverboat, which shows they trained at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. So it's very symbolic of the early days of the 442.
There's also a motto, isn't there?
Yes, go for broke. It says go for broke, which is pidgin English.
And both the 100th and 442 were total voluntary. Is that accurate?
Yes. Actually, the 100 was all volunteer. The 442 initially was a volunteer unit, but they needed more men and they had to take draftees, which is an interesting point because when the initial call came for volunteers for the 442, the response in Hawaii was amazing. I mean, they had over 4,000. Actually, it was more than that. And they had close to 10,000 that volunteered. That's about 38% of the total Japanese male in Hawaii.
Volunteered for the 442?
For the 442. On the mainland, it was different. They had a poor response. They only about 2,000 or 2,500 at most that volunteered. Now, you can see the reason why. Why should I volunteer when I'm in the concentration camp and my parents are here? We're all in the concentration. Why should we serve in the U.S. Army? What about our rights? So they had a legitimate gripe, and that's why it was very poor. In Hawaii, we weren't in concentration camps. Well, the mail says, hey, we need to show our loyalty. So you had this amazing turnout, yeah, a big difference. Now, how did the military handle this then? Well, they said, well, we still have to have a regiment, which means we have to have about 4,500 men at least. So they said, well, 2/3 are going to come from Hawaii and 1/3 from the mainland. And that's how they were able to have the 442 regiment total initial contingent of about 4,500 men at that stage in 1943.
Tell us about your recollection of their training and marching and activity.
Right. The training for the 442 and for also the 100 Battalion was basically at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Now, for the Hawaiian nieces, that was a shock. Being in a southern state. Why I say it's a shock? Because it was the first time that many of the nieces ran into such racism. For example, they saw signs said whites, colored, and the nieces said, which facility shall I use? Which one? So they never had that before. And also in going on the bus or in the restaurant, there were separate sitting arrangements, separate accommodations. They never had this. But that was the first shocking experience with racism. In Hawaii, you didn't have that type of experience. So that's what's a background on training in Mississippi.
Now you had a family member that joined the 442.
Okay.
Can you tell us about that?
My two brothers were drafted. Actually, my father needed them as employees, so he wasn't in favor of them volunteering for anything. So my two brothers were drafted. One ended up with the combat engineers and Schofield Barracks. And my other brother ended up with MIS, which is the Military Intelligence Service, But he never was served in combat by the time the war ended,
But your brother-in-law?
Brother-in-law, we affectionately call him Bozo. He's Richard Nishioka. And
you have a picture of him there?
Yeah, here's a picture of Bozo with my sister. And that's why he's my brother-in-law. And on this side here, you have my parents. So this was a picture taken together. For both those picture, I have. Oh, by the way, this is a publication of Item Company. It's kind of a unique publication. They produce this only for their family and descendants. And so it's not available to the general public. And what it has pictures of men of one infantry company and a brief description of what they wanted to write or the survivors writing. And here's a picture of Bozo Nishioka. And the write-up is by my sister, Liz. So he was wounded in the Italian campaign and got a Purple Heart, and he also was awarded a Bronze Star. So.
And they served in Europe?
Yes. The 442, it's one of those things that when you establish a combat record that's distinguished, you get called upon more often. And sometimes I wondered whether there's a bit of racism in this, you know. For example, when the 100th Battalion, was ready to march into Rome, the Germans have retreated, instead of being allowed to march victorious into Rome, the 100th Battalion was diverted. They said, well, you got to go to this port city of Civita Vecchio. Wow, well, why should we go there? Well, they weren't given a reason. Actually, at that port city is where the first contingent of the 442 landed, and they met together, But instead of being allowed to march into the city, they were diverted. Another thing that has puzzled me to this day is when the 442 were shipped from the Italian campaign, who were well involved in the Po Valley campaign, they were shipped to southern France. Okay, you're in southern France, all right, to fight the Germans there. Then they were shipped up to northern France, which is way up from southern France to all the way up to the northern part, close to the German border, to the Vosges forest. Well, why did they do that? Well, it wasn't one of the easy way to get into Germany, shortest way. But the Vosges forest was a nasty place. Quite different from the Italian landscape, which is, but you had mountains, but you had hills, and there were not that many trees. But you had a forest there in northern France. And that was quite a different way of fighting. One of the things that, reading about, what the veterans have written, is that they were afraid, especially of artillery fire coming up and hitting the branches, and when they exploded, all the shrapnel's gone. In most, casualties from artillery comes not from the direct explosion of the shell, but from the shrapnels. So they were getting showered with shrapnel. So that's the kind of battle. It was at the Vosges forest that the men assigned to rescue the lost battalion of this 36th Infantry Division. They got one battalion that was trapped by the Germans. And the 442 unit was sent in to rescue this lost battalion. They succeeded after a vicious battle, but they suffered heavy casualty, over 800. How many survivors did they rescue? 241. To rescue 241, they suffered 800 casualties, over. Why did the general send the 442 unit on such a mission? We don't know. Some say there's racist. It was, just a cannon fodder, is what some of the term used. Just send them in as a sacrifice. For whatever the reason, it's the Vosges Mountains is very famous. And by the way, the Texans became friends, and they had after the war they socialized. They had reunions. They got together. They became friends. Yeah.
I think you said that the 100th Battalion still exists today, but the 442nd does not.
That's right. Yes, it's kind of unique for any World War II unit to be activated to this today. So yeah, the 100 is maybe the only unit like that. The 442 is a bit deactivated. So the 100th Battalion has served in Afghanistan, in other combat, to this day, you could volunteer for the unit.
Could you tell us about the awards and honors that 100th and 442nd received for all their combat experience in Europe? during the war?
Well, as often cited, the 442 emerged out of World War II as the highest decorated military unit for its size. What is the legacy, you may well say? Well, did it cure racism? No, it existed. However, it did turn the thinking of many, military units today, of course, are integrated. You don't have all, ethnic groupings anymore. The Navy took a little longer, but they have come around. So that's one of the legacy and of the 442 and 100. And also, I think they established a record there that future generations can look to. So you see, it's kind of unique in the sense that other ethnic groups are not going to go through this kind of experience. Hopefully not, anyway. So it helped in the assimilation of the Japanese Americans into American society, but it also deterred. They did face oppositions, all the way.
In what way did it deter?
Yeah. It deterred in the sense that it was part of the total environment of, being forced to, show your loyalty. So for some Japanese, they said that they're not going to go and do it. So you did have dissident. You did have people that were against the draft, So now it's not as well publicized, but there were groups like that. In fact, even in the Japanese community, at first there was resentment that some of these Niseis were against the draft, were against volunteering, were against the war effort. And they were called, resistors, un-American. It took a while, but the Japanese community, especially the Citizen League, decided to apologize. They realized that those people were sincere. Yes, there was an infringement on their rights. They were in concentration camp, and they were exercising what they thought was the higher principle to stand by their rights, and that's why they resisted being volunteered. But it took a while, even in the Japanese community, to come around to that, to apologize. The U.S. government also apologized, later on. So, yes, the motive there, or why they resisted, was a noble one, So, the appreciation. But that's part of the legacy. That's why I say it's in some way a positive thing, but also was a negative thing, Yeah.
A way of really showing their loyalty.
Well, that's how they, to show the loyalty is, it's a difficult thing. It's, even the veterans would say, that they had to do it, They would, for them, they saw no other alternative. Now, as I say, it didn't solve racism because, when they came back, they experienced it. However, because they'd spent time in the service, their perspective changed. And for some of them, they decided to further their education, got into the profession, and they got into politics. Can you imagine that? Especially in Hawaii. So you had Nisei by the 1950s becoming the dominant political force in Hawaii. It dominated the legislature.
So, Japanese Americans volunteering for the 100th Battalion and the 442nd was really a way that they could show their loyalty to the United States.
That's right. That was the main reason, yes.
I'd like to ask a few more questions.
Sure.
Based upon your vast personal and educational experiences, if there is one piece of advice or words of wisdom that you could give your children or young adults today, what would that be?
Mm-hmm. My advice is to be proud of your cultural heritage. That's very important. You know, our emphasis, for many Americans anyway, has been on assimilation. But assimilation doesn't mean completely turn over, discard your background, your heritage, and just take on all that is what we call Americanism. But that is not what should evolve. America is a country of diversity. And this is where each ethnic group has their heritage. And I would say for the descendants of the immigrants, you have to promote, you have to protect, you have to maintain your heritage, because that's what gives America that uniqueness that makes them stand out as a society with diversity. And the experience of the Nisei especially shows that this is very important. Other ethnic groups have to go through this experience, and that hopefully they will maintain their cultural heritage. You know, today we get excited that we have St. Patrick's Day, Cinco de Mayo. We have, you know, the Germans with Oktoberfest. These are old traditions, but they're part of America too. So, you know, it's a kind of that brings people together. It's kind of strange in the sense that diversity, you think, oh, you got too many different things going on and you separate us. But diversity also, for the individuals, gives them pride in their culture and they bring it together. So that's why in America we have that, which is so you don't have in many countries. Okay, America is a nation of immigrants.
And respect for other cultures.
As respect, right. As you build your own cultural identity, you respect others because you know the processes involved and you appreciate other culture. So that's important. And the experience of the Nisei especially shows that this is, you know, the crux of the matter, you know. I always say that although there are some Americans that say diversity is a bad word, no. Diversity is something we should celebrate and not put down. It is the essence of American society today, especially today. Yeah.
Now, based upon this advice, have your children made choices that reflect that?
Yeah, you know, it's one of those things. In our family, we never really, you know, promoted Japanese things. You know, we speak English, and you know, and we ate American food and so on. Part of the experience is, you know, is what does it mean? You know, what kind of legacy, what lesson does it teach us? You know, and of course, one of the things we learn is that we have to be on guard, especially for our civil rights and liberties, and because the democracy is a very fragile system, and it can be easily subverted, not maybe completely taken away, but it can be lessened. So those are the things that, I take away from all of this, and it's not a given. Even if you succeed, let's say, in attaining social status, financial status, and you're doing very well in society, okay, by all means you are successful. But, it's what is happening in the society around you, So, do you gain that respect, It's so, and what is the personal relationship you have, Do you appreciate each other? So those are the things that I think we need to constantly be aware of, that it's not an easy thing. As I say, democracy is very fragile and can be easily upset. So we have to be constantly on guard. The trite remark is that never forget, you have to learn from history. Yes, we say that, but it's very easily to forget. And so this is a reminder that we have, and perhaps even a project like this is a reminder that there is something to our culture, there is something to our past experience, and that will be very useful for our descendants and also for our friends. So anybody interested in Japanese culture. So that's the lesson I hope that we all learn. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your wonderful story with us. This now concludes the videotape interview of Dr. Minoru Yanagihashi. Thank you very much.